This podcast includes discussion of rape and sexual assault, abuse, murder, and other criminal behavior. Listener discretion is advised.
His decision that night in April of '85 altered my life forever.
Joyce Yost's daughter, Kim Salazar, was not satisfied. Doug Lovell, the man convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting her mother, was headed for sentencing, but not for Joyce's murder.
She told the detectives, I remember telling them, I know that son of a bitch has something to do with it. I know he has something to do with it. And they told Kim, well, we're sure he is too, but we just can't go over there and just tell him that he has something to do with it. We have to figure something out here.
Two years earlier, the Utah legislature had established a system of minimum mandatory sentences.
The reason we call it mandatory is the judge, if you got the conviction, the judge could not give him probation.
That's retired Davis County prosecutor Brian Namba. Under the law, Judge Rodney Page had to send Doug to prison for at least 10 years, unless there were mitigating circumstances, in which case Doug would get no less than 5. Or if there were aggravating circumstances, he would get no less than 15. Brian had filed a motion arguing in favor of the longer 15-year term.
So there's a list of potential aggravating circumstances.
They included Doug's pattern of stalking women, the extreme cruelty and depravity of his attack on Joyce, his history of violent offenses, his pending charges for car theft, and his hostility toward Joyce's family. Brian also pointed out it was only because of Joyce's hesitancy to testify about specific sexual acts during the preliminary hearing that the sodomy charge had been dropped. Doug's attorney, John Hutchison, did not file a motion of his own full of mitigating circumstances. Instead, he simply asked Judge Page to treat Doug's convictions as misdemeanors, which would spare him prison time altogether. Hutchison argued it would be unduly harsh to send Doug away for so long because of, quote, the nature and circumstances of the offense and the defendant's history and character. Judge Page reviewed a confidential pre-sentence report prepared by an agency called Adult Probation and Parole, or AP&P. It included background information on Doug, his family relationships, his criminal history, as well as the impact of his crime on Joyce and her loved ones. Kim and her husband Randy had sat through Doug's trial in December of '85, a trial at which Kim's own mother, the victim, was absent.
They had a woman on the stand, and they had a picture of her, of my mom, on the stand, and they just had that woman read word for word what my mom had said during the preliminary hearing.
And they had seen for the first time Doug's wife, Rhonda.
I just remember being disgusted by all of their shenanigans, you know, in between. They just came off as this loving couple, and, you know, it just wasn't the case.
Doug's convictions were about to put that loving relationship to the test. This is Cold, Season 2, Episode 5, Garden Variety. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley. We'll be right back. Doug Lovell returned to court for sentencing on the afternoon of January 16, 1986. Judge Rodney Page asked defense attorney John Hutchison if there was anything he wanted to say. John said he had read the pre-sentence report and believed its recommendations were, quote, disproportionately large to the nature of the evidence. Judge Page then turned to Doug and asked if he had anything to say. Just the fact that I am innocent, Doug said. Judge Page told Doug he believed the case had been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury had got it right. He then handed down the maximum for each of the 2 counts, no less than 15 years and possibly up to life. The sentences would run concurrently at the same time, meaning the soonest Doug could hope to be released from prison would be 2001. This was a victory not only for the prosecution, but also personally for Detective Bill Holthouse, who told me he remembered John Hutchison's reaction.
This was not on the record. This was afterwards. He said, "My client wants to appeal and I quit."
I asked Bill what he made of that statement.
That he knew he was guilty of sin and did his job and now he was done, is what I made out of it. I knew John pretty well. He'd go to bat for his client, but he knew he was guilty.
But guilty of what? Sexual assault or something worse? Randy Salazar kept hearing Doug's words in his head. "She's gone, buddy."
I mean, that's pretty much telling you that, you know what, I had something to do with this.
Just days after Doug's sentencing in the rape case, the city attorney in Washington Terrace dropped all charges stemming from Doug's June 20th, 1985 DUI arrest, the one where he was caught driving drunk toward Joyce's apartment with a loaded handgun. The prosecutor said abandoning the case would be in the interest of justice because Doug already faced a long prison sentence. He noted there were other serious charges pending too, presumably a reference to the car theft cases out of Salt Lake City. But Doug resolved those easily. He cut a plea deal and received no additional prison time. No penalty for stealing the car he had used to kidnap Joyce Yost. The Utah State Prison Complex occupied a spot at the southern end of the Salt Lake Valley known as Point of the Mountain. It comprised several different buildings spread across a square mile of land. The oldest and in many ways most gloomy of them was the Wasatch facility. That's where Doug began serving his time, on Wasatch's A Block. Inmates on A Block were housed in cells with Alcatraz-style metal grill doors. This was a big change for Doug, who, on his first stint at the prison from 79 to 82, had lived in SSD, the Special Services Dormitory. Doug found himself housed next door to somebody he had met during those earlier years in SSD, a man named Roy D.J. Drody.
At the prison, Doug and I lived next door to each other on A Block, and we've become friends, reacquainted in our friendship.
I'll come back to Roy in just a moment. First, I need to acknowledge something significant Joyce's daughter Kim Salazar had noticed during the rape trial.
Rhonda was pregnant with Doug's baby by then, so she was starting to look pregnant.
Rhonda Lovell worked for the state at an office in the Eccles building in downtown Ogden. That's where, on the morning of Wednesday, March 19, 1986, South Ogden Police Sergeant Brad Birch showed up to serve her with an arrest warrant. Kim had known this was coming.
I was in communication with him every day at that point.
Brad had learned about Doug and Rhonda having been questioned by a Utah Division of Wildlife Resources officer during a drive through the Monte Cristo Mountains. The Rich County prosecutor had decided, on what evidence I can't tell you, that Rhonda had been involved in poaching.
I know that they were trying to get information.
Brad told Rhonda they were going over to police headquarters to have a little chat.
So they used this poaching as a way to put some pressure.
Brad read Rhonda her Miranda rights. Then he began to pepper her with questions. This conversation was not recorded. My account of it is based on the written reports of Brad Birch and another detective, Terry Carpenter. Here's what they said. Rhonda said she didn't know anything about any poaching. Doug had not shot any deer on the day of their drive, and she hadn't seen any dead animals. Doug did own a deer hunting rifle, she said, a Weatherby 300, but she declined to mention the other guns he had stolen with Billy Jack the prior May. So if Doug wasn't up there to shoot deer, why had they gone to the mountains? Rhonda said they had tried to go to Doug's father's cabin, but they weren't able to make it because they didn't have a key for the gate. And anyway, the real purpose of their trip was to meet some friends on the far side of the mountain, in a town called Woodruff, to go snowmobiling. Who were these friends? The detectives asked. Rhonda wouldn't or couldn't provide their names.
You know, we've wondered about that a lot, how that happened and what went on.
Terry Carpenter's memories of these events were a bit hazy when we spoke.
I don't remember all the details of that.
Which isn't surprising considering just how long ago this took place. But that's made it difficult to pinpoint just when the poaching stop occurred. The KSL TV archives show the winter season of '85 had started strong in Utah.
It was 24 degrees at Brighton today, with a 10-minute line at the Majestic ski lift.
We love it. It's great.
It is glorious. Absolutely glorious.
Is this the earliest you've ever skied?
This is the earliest I've ever skied, absolutely.
An intense storm had blanketed the high country with snow by mid-November.
Utah's winter storm in the last 2 days left 3 feet of new snow at the Salt Lake ski resorts. It fell on top of several inches of hard-packed snow already in the mountains.
So the idea Doug and Rhonda might have had a legitimate snowmobiling rendezvous planned was within the realm of possibility. But
those conditions prompted a number of warnings about avalanche danger in the high country.
We were concerned about conditions and did ask the people stay out of the high country that we were having problems.
A storm this intense would have forced the Utah Department of Transportation to close the highway that crosses the Monte Cristo Mountains. The available evidence suggests Doug and Rhonda's Monte Cristo drive happened after Joyce disappeared in mid-August, but before the road was blocked with snow in mid-November. That period spanned Utah's bow and rifle deer hunting seasons, when wildlife officers were on high alert for poachers. I described Rhonda's encounter with one such officer in the last episode.
He drove past and noticed that Rhonda was in the car.
By herself. A short time later, the same officer had spotted Rhonda in the car again, but accompanied by a man. He had stopped to talk to her again, and Rhonda had claimed the man was just a hitchhiker. But here, under the scrutiny of the South Ogden detectives, Rhonda had a different explanation for why she had been alone when the wildlife officer had first approached her.
Doug was out of the car for a minute, going to the bathroom.
She had been too embarrassed, she said, to explain this. The detectives suspected a different reason for the discrepancy.
It became apparent that she was afraid to say too much around Doug.
Brad warned Rhonda if she did not come clean, she was headed to jail. Not the Weber County Jail there in Ogden. They were going to take her way out to Randolph, on the other side of the mountains, an hour-and-a-half drive away. Well, let's go, Rhonda said.
Rhonda was 7 or 8 months pregnant, and so we transported her and tried in about every way to help her as much as we could.
I have a copy of the jail booking records. Rhonda is smiling in her mugshot. But she would later describe being miserable that night. 27 years old, husband in prison, several months pregnant, flat on her back on the floor of the jail.
So that was my first contact with Rhonda.
The court scheduled a hearing for May 13th on the poaching charge. Rhonda was ordered to appear along with Brad Birch and Doug, who had to be transported up to Randolph from the state prison. Doug and Rhonda were reunited. They went before the Rich County Circuit Court judge together. Doug told the judge he intended to act as their lawyer, and he wanted to call his wife to testify. This was all a bit much for a minor poaching citation. The judge dismissed the case on the spot. Utah's minimum mandatory sentencing law was putting the state's Department of Corrections in a pinch. The agency had only one prison in '86, and it was fast running out of space. Planning was underway for a second prison, but as a stopgap, the state began shipping some inmates out to county jails. Roy D.J. Drody, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, was among them. He ended up in Duchesne County, home to Utah's highest mountain peaks, hundreds of natural gas wells, and a whole lot of dust and sagebrush. Roy had not been there long before he reached out to South Ogden police. He claimed to have information about the disappearance of Joyce Yost. Brad Birch drove out to the Duchesne County Jail on June 4th, 1986, to talk with Roy.
And Roy, what we talked to you about is your involvement with a Mr. Doug Lovell, is that right?
Correct.
Roy told Brad Doug had enlisted his help drafting legal documents for an appeal. They had discussed Joyce Yost.
He told me that that was a young lady he was accused of raping and kidnapping back in April of '85. And in August, he killed her.
He made that statement to you?
Yes.
Roy said Doug had denied raping Joyce, but admitted killing her.
Did he say how he killed her?
No, he did not.
Did he say where?
No, he did not.
Did he say that anyone was with him at that time?
No, he did not.
The only real clue Roy was able to provide dealt with what he said were Doug's efforts to conceal Joyce's body.
In talking about moving the body, when did he say that happened?
In November, when he was stopped in November for poaching, and it was during that time that he had moved the body.
The poaching stop at Monte Cristo. The details of that were not public knowledge.
He said that he was stopped by a Fish and Game officer.
Yes. His wife was stopped and questioned first. He was not in the vehicle. And Fish and Game stopped him a second time, in which he was in the vehicle. He had just come from moving the body.
Roy said he hadn't just learned this from Doug. He'd also heard it from Rhonda herself. They had talked on the phone about it during the 3 weeks since the court hearing in the poaching case.
Do you think that she knew he was moving the body when they were there originally?
In my conversations with her, she said no. That she didn't know, that she thought he was out going to the bathroom or having a bowel movement. She did not know that he was moving the body. I had known because Doug had told me previous to that, but Rhonda did not tell me until after she had been to jail.
Roy's story, if true, would mean Joyce's body was in the Monte Cristo Mountains about 30 miles northeast of Ogden. At that very time in early June, the last bits of winter snow would have been melting off those mountain slopes. I've not found any records showing police followed up on this lead. Terry Carpenter told me they tried, but said the information was simply too vague and the Monte Cristo region too vast. Roy said he would be willing to testify if police could ensure his safety. Doug, he said, was a dangerous man who had expressed a desire to have somebody else killed.
Officer by the name of John Holtman.
Something like that.
Right, correct.
There is no person in this story named John Holtman. But to my ear, John Holtman sounds reasonably close to Bill Holthouse, the Clearfield detective who had arrested Doug the morning after the rape.
You think he still has the axe to grind against that officer?
Yes.
You think he still would do that if he had the opportunity?
Yeah. Because Doug feels he's lost a lot and will continue to lose, and he feels that the person responsible is this Officer Holtman. And he's very bitter towards him.
I mentioned this to Bill.
Disappointed he didn't know my name. But
Grateful disappointed.
yeah, just maybe a little bit.
Bill remembered getting a warning from Brad about a possible threat.
It never came to any fruition. I was apparently, for sure I was a lot more careful after that for a while.
Yeah.
But it went away like everything else. It's not the first time that a law enforcement officer has been threatened.
Doug Lovell wanted off A Block. He requested a transfer from the prison's Wasatch facility to SSD. SSD inmates lived under less restrictive security, qualified for additional recreation time, had a greater array of employment opportunities available, and so forth. Space in SSD was limited, though, and reserved for inmates who were taking part in its programs. Those included sex offender treatment and mental health support for offenders with intellectual disabilities. Doug did not have an intellectual disability. He was still publicly denying having raped Joyce, so he couldn't exactly apply for sex offender treatment. Instead, his stated reason for application to SSD was depression.
I had a very, very low self-esteem. I didn't like myself. I still really don't. There's a lot of times for the most part, I just hated me. I hated me, and I resented people that cared a lot about me.
That is Doug's own voice, captured in a phone call to Rhonda. The prison at the time classified inmates as one of 3 personality types: Kappa, Sigma, or Omega. That correlated to predator, victim, or neutral. Doug was a predator type.
I'm really a proud person in the sense that I don't like exposing myself to people. I don't like telling somebody that I have a problem.
Prison staff approved his request and moved him into SSD in the summer of '87. He began seeing a therapist there, a young woman named Kate Delapiana.
When I first started seeing her, I feel really bad about, the first few months that we spent together because I was blowing smoke up your butt. She said, I know you were. She said it was about to end, too.
Kate did not respond to my interview request for this podcast. Doug also reconnected with an old friend in SSD, Tom Peters. This audio is tough to make out, coming off a very old analog tape, but listen close and you will hear Tom say SSD had a good atmosphere, and he was able to help inmates with lower ability levels than his own.
SSD is a very good atmosphere. It's mental health. I'm a psychic. I work with the guys who are on the lower ability level than mine. So I work with these guys. It's very comfortable.
Tom had returned to prison in the spring of '87 on a new set of theft cases. He and Doug often spent their rec time together playing tennis or lifting weights. They didn't talk about what had happened to Joyce Yost. Doug kept those kinds of secrets close.
God only knows the things he's done,
So it surprised Tom when he started seeing Doug leaving those therapy sessions with Kate Delapiana.
When he goes to therapy with her, he's come out, crying before. He says he's talking about his brother's death.
Royce's death was a topic Doug rarely discussed.
I was caught in between, Royce and a lot of situations. Even after he died, I was still the situations that he left me with, left on my shoulders. And when Royce was around, he helped me deal with things, sometimes by not even talking about it. But he was there.
Doug had never even been candid about Royce's death with Rhonda.
Sometimes when you have secrets, you spend so much time and energy in trying to hide them.
Rhonda visited Doug at the prison regularly, bringing the kids Cody and Alicia with her. Only then, in their separation, had Doug started to see Rhonda as his best friend.
No, I never thought I'd ever say that, in a woman. And I never realized, up until now, until lately through my therapy, so, just what the hell I had out there.
There is another person Doug came to know around this same time, but you couldn't call him a friend. His name was Carl Jacobson. Carl had taken a job as a corrections officer at the prison in '83, just as he was turning 22 years old. His first assignment was on A Block, but he transferred to SSD midway through 86, placing him there shortly before Doug arrived. Carl's duties in SSD included sitting in on group therapy sessions for inmates in the Merit 2 program, which is what Doug joined when he arrived at SSD in 87. Carl found Doug easy to manage. He would stop by Doug's bunk when making his rounds each evening, and they would watch the 6 o'clock news together. Doug, in turn, learned Carl was someone he could safely feed information to when the situation warranted. A symbiotic relationship. Roy City Police Dispatcher Betty Nicholas was at work on Friday, April 3, 1987, when, just after noon, she took a phone call. The caller, a man, told Betty he had found a body. He was an avid hiker, he said, and had been back in an area where few people go. Betty asked the man's name. He refused to give it, saying he didn't want to get wrapped up in anything. She reassured him he wasn't in any trouble, she just needed more information, like an address. All he would say was the body was decayed. Betty urged the man to call the Weber County Sheriff's Office, the agency responsible for cases outside of city limits. She told him there were several missing women from the area whom police were eager to find. A little later that same afternoon, Weber County Sheriff's Dispatcher Shelley Tracy took a call from the same man.
I called about Crime Stoppers, the number.
He wanted information on how to get in touch with Crime Stoppers, an organization that allows people to submit anonymous tips.
I'm reporting a body that I found.
A body?
Yeah, a body that I just happened across way up. It's way out. It's not in the communities or anything. It's way out in the hills.
The man said he had parked his car near Causey Dam, an impoundment on the South Fork of the Ogden River about 20 miles east of Ogden, and hiked 2 or 3 miles back into the mountains behind the reservoir. That's where he had found the body.
There was a purse there.
Was it a lady?
Well, I assumed the body was a lady's, but I didn't open the purse or anything.
Would you like to get a name?
No, I'm not interested in reading search warrants.
Shelley told the man she just needed his name and number so she could have an officer call him to gather more specific information. He refused.
Would you explain to me where it's at?
Well, if you have half an hour.
The man said he had been in the area searching for sediments and would have to use a specialized geologic map to pinpoint the spot.
You won't give me your name?
I'm just reporting, that's a week. No, of course not. I didn't have anything to do with it,
Shelley asked if he would wait on hold just long enough for her to grab an investigator. He agreed, but hung up before she returned to the call moments later. Let me tell you a bit about Causey Reservoir. Causey is surrounded by mountain ridges that rise 1,000, 2,000, almost 3,000 feet above the water's surface. Beyond the reservoir and between the ridges are several canyons, the bottoms of which are thick with vegetation. These canyons are cut in a 180-degree arc, from 12 to 6 on the face of a clock. Wheatgrass Canyon is at the top, and Skullcrack Canyon is at the bottom. Wheatgrass ascends all the way to the base of Monte Cristo, the mountain near where Doug and Rhonda were suspected of poaching. Skullcrack is home to a private cabin community called Causey Estates. The summer homes there are scattered among stands of quaking aspen and are only accessible through a locked gate. Between Wheatgrass and Skullcrack, to the east, are a series of canyons and ridges rarely visited except by hunters and ranchers. The anonymous caller had not indicated which of these canyons held the remains. That didn't stop sheriff's deputies from searching. They went out 5 days after the anonymous call and combed the area around Causey Dam with no results. A month later, police in Ogden arrested a man named Kerry Hartman in connection with a series of 4 rapes committed in 1986 and early 87.
Prosecutors say their key evidence in the case against Hartman are statements he made to police at the time of his arrest, information from police lab tests, and a victim's testimony.
Carey had previously worked as a reserve officer for the Ogden Police Department. Investigators had also discovered he had been dating Cherie Warren at the time of her disappearance in October of 85.
She was last seen leaving her job at a credit union in Salt Lake to meet her estranged husband at a downtown auto dealership. Investigators on the case...
I mentioned Cherie in the last episode. Police at the time considered both Carey Hartman and Cherie's estranged husband, Charles, persons of interest. After Carey's arrest on the rape charge, Ogden Police Captain Marlon Balls phoned Weber County Sheriff's Lieutenant Archie Smith with a tantalizing lead. A witness claimed to have seen Carey at Causey Estates the weekend after Cherie vanished. Balls suggested the body the anonymous caller had found could be Cherie. So, investigators visited Causey again on June 20th, 1987. This time they focused on the canyon adjacent to Causey Estates, but again didn't find anything. A few months later, a jury convicted Carey Hartman in the first of the rape cases.
The guilty verdict brought tears to family members and even some jurors in the courtroom. The victim agreed to shed her cloak of anonymity and talked with reporters about her feelings, she said, as a way to help other rape victims.
I think if I have the strength to finally be on camera, that maybe it'll give other people strength through me.
Carey Hartman headed to the Utah State Prison on a sentence of 15 to life, just like Doug Lovell. And, like Doug, he landed in SSD. Doug kept his appellate attorney, David Grindstaff, busy during that summer of 87. Doug still owed on the loan he had taken out against his stolen Mazda, but responsibility for making those payments had fallen on Rhonda.
He was in prison and she was going to have a rough time making payments on it, especially with the kids.
That is Susan, the loan officer who Doug had showered with yellow roses at the beginning of our story.
She got really upset and she said that they were going to file bankruptcy, which they did.
She worked with Rhonda in arranging payments. The appellate attorney David Grindstaff handled that bankruptcy case. At the same time, David put together a brief for the Utah Supreme Court arguing Doug had been wrongly convicted. He raised 7 points on appeal. First, David said the testimony of Sharon Guess about having been stalked by a red car with flip-up lights had prejudiced the jury. Second, he said the trial court had given the jury bad instructions regarding venue. Third, he took issue with Judge Rodney Page's decision to tell the jurors Joyce had been missing for 2 months. Fourth, he said the prosecution hadn't established chain of custody regarding Joyce's dress, pantyhose, bra, and the blue men's shirt, which were all admitted as evidence. Fifth, he said the sentence was too harsh because the state hadn't proved Doug's attack on Joyce rose to the level of extreme cruelty and depravity required by the law. Sixth, he said Doug's trial attorney John Hutchison had failed to object to all of the above, meaning Doug was denied effective counsel. And seventh, he said the use of Joyce's testimony during the trial had deprived Doug of his right to confront the witnesses against him. The Utah Attorney General's office disputed every point. The Utah Supreme Court scheduled oral arguments for December 14th, 1987. Rhonda wrote a letter to her husband a couple of weeks before that date. Here's what it said.
I sure do miss you, honey. I want you home so bad. I can't stand it. I love you so much. Baby, you are the best. I hope the appeal will turn out good. I'm excited to go see what it will be like. I hope they hurry with the decision so I can have you home where you belong.
On the day of the oral arguments, Brian Namba sat and listened as David Grindstaff made his presentation to the justices.
He called it a garden variety rape.
A garden variety rape. The comment caught the attention of Justice Christine Durham, the first and at the time only female justice on Utah's highest court.
I thought she was going to jump over the bench and strangle him for calling it a garden variety rape.
Oh, he said that in oral argument?
Yeah.
Brian told me he suspected Doug would try to downplay the callousness of the rape in his inevitable appeal.
That's why I filed a written statement so that it'd be in the record, and always looking towards appeal and having the Supreme Court be able to have a tangible piece of paper with a list on it of things that are limited to the status of the rape, does not include anything having to do with potential murder.
Brian hadn't wanted the Supreme Court thinking Doug was being punished for killing Joyce, even though he had only been convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting her. On the flip side, the fact Doug had not yet been charged with Joyce's murder festered like an open wound for her family.
Kim was not satisfied with the rape.
Joyce's daughter Kim Salazar and her husband Randy had kept hounding Sergeant Brad Birch.
Kim is so frustrated because every time she calls, there's nothing they got.
They were not the only ones in the dark. Detective Bill Holthouse often bumped into Joyce's sister Dorothy and her kids around town.
I was approached a lot, let's put it that way. What's going on? What's going on? What's going on?
Bill didn't have anything to tell them. South Ogden police were investigating the disappearance, not Clearfield, and they weren't sharing information. South Ogden Police Sergeant Brad Birch promoted to lieutenant at the end of 1987. The move meant he no longer led the investigation into Joyce Yost's disappearance.
My communication with them all obviously became less and less over the years.
Kim Salazar had kept in touch with Brad and the rest of the detectives, including Terry Carpenter.
They were helpful. They were honest, I think.
But we were still at a loss as to what had happened to Joyce.
Kim's on this all the time. Kim is constantly calling these guys, seeing if they found anything out.
Kim and her husband Randy believed they knew right where Joyce's killer was, the Utah State Prison, even if police couldn't prove it.
But he is cocky down there. He's very cocky.
Terry Carpenter soon moved into the position Brad Birch had held before him.
I was actually promoted to the detective sergeant and inherited the case.
Terry was an Ogden native. He had attended Weber State College and had been inspired to pursue a career as a police officer by an older brother. He was 15 years into that career by the time he took over the Joyce Yost case.
Things had gotten very stagnant until he took over.
Not that anybody had done anything wrong. They had exhausted about everything that they could.
Terry didn't have much of a direction to follow, at least at first. That changed in March of '88 when Terry received an unexpected phone call from a woman who wanted to remain anonymous.
Why don't you give me the name George?
George, okay. I don't have a problem with that at all.
George wanted a few details about the Joyce Yost case.
Was that she had blonde hair and that she was raped.
That's correct.
And asked if it remained an open investigation.
Okay. Why is the case open?
Why is it open? Because we've never been able to conclude any kind of a location or whereabouts.
George said she was speaking with another woman who had possibly witnessed Joyce's murder.
Now I'm getting a little paranoid, okay? So if you don't mind my paranoia, you won't put a tracer on this car, will you?
I understand that completely.
Are you comfortable with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Terry told George any information she might have could prove valuable.
She was murdered by a friend of the guy that raped her, who paid someone to kill her, and she was tortured and killed in a satanic ritual.
She said Joyce's body had then been burned and scattered.
Right now we can't give you any more information, although this person said they'd be willing to talk to you sometime in the future.
Terry said he would do whatever it took to protect this witness if she would just come forward. George said that couldn't happen yet.
And I appreciate your kindness.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you calling.
Okay.
All right. Bye now.
The Utah Supreme Court issued its decision on Doug's appeal on July 14, 1988. The 5 justices were unanimous. They dismissed every single one of his claims. Chief Justice Gordon Hall authored the opinion, in which he made direct reference to the statement from Doug's attorney that the rape of Joyce Yost had been of the, quote, garden variety.
That was a big mistake on his part. Justice Durham, I thought, boy, if looks could kill, I've never seen her so mad.
That again is Brian Namba, the prosecutor from the rape case. The Chief Justice wrote there was ample evidence in the record of Doug's pattern of criminal behavior, as well as his extreme cruelty toward Joyce, to justify the 2 sentences of 15 to life. Vindication for Brian, who had made sure to include those details in his motions. It had proven tricky since he had also had to avoid implying Doug was responsible for Joyce's disappearance.
But that's sort of my strategy, is to try to take some of that incendiary stuff out of it, because you got to keep the record clean. And so they can look at it and say, well, maybe he did, but here's all this other stuff that justifies what happened.
The specter of Doug winning release came off the table, much to the relief of Joyce's family and South Ogden police.
We knew he wasn't going anywhere, so they had time.
Did they, though? Doug still had 2 paths to freedom open to him. One went through the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole, where he had once before won an early release. The other went through the federal courts. Weber County Sheriff's Lieutenant Archie Smith had an idea. In September of '88, he wrote a letter to a man named Murray Myron. Here's what the letter said.
Dear Mr. Myron, I recently attended a psychological profiling course in Salt Lake City, Utah. The instructor suggested that you are an expert in language analysis and may be able to assist us in a criminal homicide case.
Myron held a PhD in psycholinguistics, the intersection of how we speak or write and how we think. In the letter, Smith told the story of the caller who had reported finding human remains near Kazi in April of '87.
The caller would not identify himself, and we attempted, through the news media, to try to get the caller to call again with negative results. We searched the area 3 times with a large force and were still unable to locate a body.
Myron is deceased now, but had worked as a professor at Syracuse University and had advised the FBI on several high-profile cases, including the Patty Hearst kidnapping and the Son of Sam serial killings. He claimed an ability to psychoanalyze a person based on little more than their diction and dialect.
I'm sending to you a copy of the conversation of the caller with our dispatcher. Maybe you can tell us a little about the person and how we can go about locating him.
Myron's response came about 6 weeks later. Here's what he wrote.
It is my evaluation that the caller is a high school educated white male approximately between the ages of 45 and 60. The dialect markers are consistent with those of a native of the northwestern United States.
Myron said the caller's claims had the, quote, texture of truthfulness, with the exception of the statements about his identity.
In my judgment, the caller did discover a body in an advanced stage of decomposition sufficient to have masked the sex of the victim, but is misrepresenting his purposes for being in the area in which he found the body. It is not likely that he was searching for sediments.
Maybe, Myron said, the caller lived nearby or was working on some sort of geological survey. But he said a government employee wouldn't show so much hesitation in assisting the authorities. It didn't seem he had any reason for avoiding interaction with the police beyond the disruption to his daily routine. Myron said appeals to the caller's conscience would likely fail.
The caller evidences little moral outrage or indication regarding the fate of the victim or interest in seeing her killer brought to justice. Instead, he appears to be motivated by the pragmatic concern of making the most minimal effort, which will discharge what he perceives to be his only nominal civic responsibilities.
Myron suggested police play clips of the tape on the news.
Investigators believe the body could be that of either Cherie Warren or Joyce Yost, two Weber County women who mysteriously disappeared in 1985 and are presumed murdered.
Along with reassurances, they did not believe the caller was guilty of any crime.
We believe that he did in fact find a body, and we desperately need him to lead us to that body.
But that may be difficult.
Archie Smith enlisted the help of Utah crime solvers in putting together this public service announcement, which aired on television that winter.
Ogden Canyon. The caller stated that he had parked in the Causey Dam area up Ogden Canyon and had hiked 2 to 3 miles back into the mountains. While there, he discovered the decomposed remains of a body. Because of a purse he found near the body, the victim is believed to be a female.
The Crime Solvers segment involved a reenactment of the body's discovery, as well as another plea for help.
The caller's description of the area where the body was located was very vague. Several searches of the area have proven unsuccessful. We need to hear from that caller, or anyone who can identify the voice of the caller, if only for the sake of the victim's family.
Utah Crime Solvers offered a reward for information about the location of the body or the identity of the anonymous caller. It did not help. The caller never came forward. To this day, he has not been identified, and the remains near Causey have not been located or recovered. It's worth noting, though, that the call came in on April 3rd, 2 years to the day after Doug's initial attack on Joyce outside her apartment. And more importantly, Doug, who often watched the 6 o'clock news with prison guard Carl Jacobson, saw the Crime Solvers segment.
Call Crime Solvers about this or any criminal activity. You will remain anonymous.
Rhonda Lovell continued writing her husband letters through the spring of '89.
It's just not the same with you, not with us. Doug, I love you with all my heart and soul, and I never want us to be apart from each other. I would die without you, Doug. Us and the kids are one, and we can never break that.
Doug had a job working in the prison sign shop. He didn't earn much, but he sent her something every month.
I really appreciate the money you send to us. It helps out so much, honey. I don't know how I'd survive if you didn't send money.
Rhonda talked about how quickly the kids were growing.
I've been thinking about you extra today. We cooked hamburgers and hot dogs outside, and it brought back a lot of memories. It seems like yesterday when you were out on the deck cooking hamburgers for us. What I'd give to have it like that again. We were so happy, so carefree and alive.
All of this wistful talk over the idea of Doug winning his freedom. But with every passing month, it became more clear that wasn't going to happen quickly, if at all. Doug's therapist, Kate Delapiana, had reached what seemed a breakthrough during the summer of '89. She had managed to get Doug talking about the death of his brother Royce.
Royce was a very cold person, and he was very brutal with certain situations, and I never could be like that, but yet I tried to be.
But Kate was moving on from that position at the prison. Rhonda noticed that with Kate's departure, her husband's tone changed.
Why don't you ever talk about Royce anymore? Just because you don't see Kate anymore doesn't mean you don't talk about it anymore. Please don't shut me out again, okay? Please talk to me, baby.
Rhonda had by then waited 4 years for Doug to come home. It proved too much. She wrote Doug another letter at the end of that year, telling him she intended to move on with her life. Doug shared Rhonda's Dear John letter with Kate as she was arranging his handoff to a different therapist.
She says, I got a feeling that, maybe you and Rhonda will get back together. And she looks at me, kind of hope, that little innocent look on her face. And I said, I don't know. I said, I kind of think, that it's possible maybe too much has happened between us.
Rhonda had hired an attorney. It turned out to be Steve Kaufman, the man whose band Joyce Yost had gone to see on the last night of her life. Rhonda filed for divorce in late December. In an affidavit, she cited irreconcilable differences rising from her husband's incarceration. She wrote until the divorce was granted, Doug would have, quote, a tendency to feel that he has a strong hold. But Doug did not contest the divorce. He agreed to pay child support and gave up any claim on their shared property. He only asked that Rhonda hand over his clothing and his bedroom furniture, including his waterbed. By March of 1990, Rhonda Lovell reverted to Rhonda Butters. Doug and Rhonda had been divorced for only about 2 months when, in May of '90, a man named Drew Dunifer dropped by a pawn shop on Ogden's 25th Street. He brought 2 guns with him, 1 rifle and 1 shotgun. The shop, called 25th Street Pawn, gave Drew $300 for the shotgun. A few weeks later, an Ogden detective stopped by 25th Street Pawn. He checked the shotgun's serial number. It came back as stolen out of the town of Liberty 5 years earlier. It was one of the guns taken from the house of Cody Montgomery Sr. You might remember Cody's wife Karen described that burglary a couple of episodes back. Weber County Sheriff's Detective Jeff Malin went to 25th Street Pawn several days later and seized the shotgun. The statute of limitations had expired, meaning even if Jeff could figure out who had stolen the shotgun, he wouldn't be able to secure criminal charges. Still, he had a duty to return the gun to its rightful owner. And of course, he wanted to figure out how the gun had ended up at the pawn shop. The shop's records included Drew Dunifer's contact information. Jeff worked backward from there. Drew did not respond when I reached out to request an interview, so I can only tell you what the detective's report and handwritten notes show. They say Drew told Jeff the gun had belonged to the son of the woman he was then dating. Her ex-husband had bought the shotgun from another pawn shop, the Gift House, in early '86. When this girlfriend and her ex divorced later that year, the ex had given the shotgun to her son. The woman and her son had subsequently moved in with Drew. That is how he came to possess the shotgun. I need to be clear. There is no suggestion Drew did anything wrong here. Who had pawned the shotgun the first time at the Gift House? No one could say. The 5th anniversary of Joyce's disappearance came in August of 1990 with no break in the investigation. But the anniversary brought with it fresh news coverage, which breathed new life into an old lead. A bit earlier, I talked about how Sergeant Terry Carpenter had received an anonymous call in March of '88. The caller had said Joyce had died in a satanic ritual.
And then her body was burned.
Her body was burned. Do you know where this occurred at all?
No, actually, I don't.
Nothing much had come of that tip until those news reports around the 5th anniversary. A different woman saw them and reached out to Terry.
She wishes to explain some of the circumstances that she is aware of involving Joyce Yost. Is that correct? Yes. Okay.
Terry agreed to give this woman anonymity.
The other promise that I'll make you is when it comes time that we may want your testimony in court, I'll clarify that with you before we reveal who you are.
I'm aware of this woman's identity, but have not had a chance to speak with her myself. As a result, I'm going to honor Terry's promise of anonymity. I will simply call her Kay. Kay told Terry a convoluted story about a friend of hers, a woman named Barbara, who was part of a satanic coven.
Barbara, she never went in detail. I know that she still had a goblet and candles and things that they used to use. They used to meet there at this house all the time.
At the same house?
Yes.
The leader of the coven was supposedly a friend of Doug Lovell's. Kay said B told her this friend had accepted a contract to kill Joyce on Doug's behalf.
Did she say how they killed her?
She said beat, tortured, raped, and stabbed.
Then, Kay said the coven had driven Joyce's body up Weber Canyon and disposed of it along an old dirt road.
Barbara said that she took a necklace off that she had been wearing and put it on the body. That it was the Italian, the Hornstein style necklace. They were really big in the disco. And that she had put that on the body and that Joyce's purse had been left with the body.
Kay's account fell right in line with what that caller, who had asked to be identified as George, had said in '88, giving the bizarre story an air of credibility. But this claim of a ritualistic killing was also right in line with the popular media of the day.
In the last 4 years, the Utah Attorney General's office says it has received dozens of reports of ritualistic abuse. Investigators say it exists, but it's hard to prove.
A full discussion of the so-called satanic panic craze of the 80s and 90s is beyond the scope of this podcast. But prominent figures in media, including Oprah Winfrey and Geraldo Rivera, were around this time broadcasting specials about the perceived dangers posed by satanic cults.
But some experts say incidents of ritualistic worship and abuse in Utah are not widespread.
It happens, not to the degree that people generally claim that it does, and I think it often happens in response to publicity.
Terry did not dismiss the account, whatever his personal skepticism.
This cult or this coven that he was involved with, were there other people that participated the night the killing took place except these that you've named?
I don't know.
Kay offered to take Terry out to the house where the coven met. It sat next to a large gravel pit near the mouth of Weber Canyon, about 5 miles south of Joyce's apartment. Terry was intrigued. He told news reporters he had received information from an informant who said Joyce Yost had, quote, met with violence. The Deseret News published a story with the headline, "Clues May Aid in Ogden Case."
You want to either prove or disprove every possible lead that you can come on.
Terry soon identified and located the woman at the center of the coven claim, Barbara. Terry began meeting with Barbara, attempting to get more information.
Here's what I didn't do anything. I was just there. I didn't do anything. And I don't even know what was done.
Listen to me. If that's accurate, and that's the case, then I have no doubt in my mind that the county attorney will grant you immunity.
Terry discovered the call from George in '88 had come from Barbara's psychologist. While in therapy, she had recovered a memory of a ritualistic murder. She claimed to have once seen a petite, blonde-haired woman dismembered by men in black robes.
She believed for all the world that Joyce was one of the sacrifices that her father was involved with, and that Joyce was sacrificed and disposed of.
But the story seemed to shift with each telling.
How's it going to look when I went on the witness stand and say, gee, Judge, I can't remember if I was there or not. Gee, Judge, I have multiple personalities.
You heard that right. Barbara said, I have multiple personalities.
You could talk to her and you could look at her physically, eye to eye, and she would change mannerisms, she would change voices, she would change from being a total absolute prude to being a sloven, whatever you want to call her.
Barbara had been diagnosed with what's now known as dissociative identity disorder, which meant Terry needed to speak with whichever personality had witnessed the supposed coven killing. He met with Barbara and her psychologist, intent on drawing out this particular persona.
Got your handcuffs ready? Got your gun. And that would hurt me, so don't.
Barbara bounced between personalities in this audio recording of that meeting.
Why did they bring him?
To bring the Antichrist.
She offered graphic descriptions of a ritual murder.
They buried her in different places.
She at times mocked or threatened Terry.
Am I hurting your feelings?
No. You can't hurt my feelings. How much hair does this guy have and what does it look like?
Well, he certainly has more than you. I have to pick on you. You're making me hurt.
You're right. So that's fair.
Making me hurt bad.
At other times, she pleaded for Terry's help.
Carpenter, this hurts. Make it stop.
I'm being very selective about what I share from this recording considering the circumstances. But it's important to know the tape revealed Terry to be a cop who showed compassion. Part of that might be because his relationship to Barbara wasn't just one of officer and informant.
She was in my ward.
A ward is a local congregation of the Latter-day Saint Church. Terry was at the time serving as bishop over his ward. That position of leadership in the church's lay clergy had provided him ample opportunity to get to know Barbara's various personalities.
She would call as a little boy. She would call as a little girl.
But in his role as detective, Terry needed Barbara to give him names of the coven members. And so he had to press her.
I won't tell, I won't tell. I won't tell no one, I won't tell. I promise I won't tell. I won't tell, I won't tell. I won't tell, I won't tell, I won't tell. I won't tell, I won't tell.
Terry and a CSI team had already scoured the area around the Coven house.
I took canines and I took cadaver dogs in there.
They had found traces of blood, but forensic testing had revealed that blood didn't even appear to be human. Near as the crime lab could tell, the blood had come from a chicken. During a later search of a nearby gravel pit, the crime scene unit located a chip of bone. They likewise sent that off for forensic testing, which proved inconclusive. If the coven existed, and if they had had something to do with the death of Joyce Yost, they had covered their tracks. Four days after Terry Carpenter's meeting with Kay, Clearfield detective Bill Holthouse went into his office and found a slip of paper waiting on his desk. It was a phonogram, a little form the secretaries used to scribble down messages. This phonogram said Sergeant Carpenter from South Ogden had called for Bill regarding a person named Joey. Last name Schost. Joey Yost. Bill called Terry back, and Terry explained he was making a new push on the Joyce Yost investigation. He had a lot of people he needed to talk to about a new lead saying Joyce had died in a contract killing. Bill had been in the dark about South Ogden's investigation for 5 years.
I had no official involvement other than to occasionally ask South Ogden what was going on, up until they put the task force together.
That was about to change. Bill said he wanted in.
And there were little odds and ends we did for South Ogden, interviewing this person, interviewing that kind of person.
The biggest interview of the entire investigation was about to come, bringing with it a surprise break. If you or someone you know has endured rape, sexual assault, or sexual abuse of any kind, help is available. In the United States, you can call 1-800-656-HOPE. or visit rainn.org to connect with free resources through the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. No one need suffer in silence. You are not alone. If you haven't already, please subscribe to or follow Cold to make sure you get every episode. You can also interact with me and the Cold team on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Cold Podcast. Cold is researched and written by Dave Cawley, with editorial oversight by executive producer Cheryl Worsley. Additional executive producers include Paul Anderson, Nick Piniella, and Andrew Greenwood. Audio production by Nina Ernest. Mixing by Trent Sell. Michael Bonmiller composed the main score. Special thanks to the team at Amazon Music. Full credits for each episode are available at thecoldpodcast.com. Cold is an Amazon original by KSL Podcasts in association with Workhouse Media. Thank you for listening.